Greetings all! Welcome back to another somewhat delayed Q&A. It does seem to be rather par for the course for these days. For those of you not following on Patreon, my attempt to fly out to do more Inside the Hatch filming has failed miserably and now needs to be rescheduled, hopefully within the month. Importantly though, new t-shirts are available. Yes, the T28 gets its time to shine. As usual, for those who are interested in reduced shipping packages, the older shirts are also being reissued as well. Look at the link down below. Also, as usual, these are batch prints, so the shirts will accept orders for a couple of weeks and then the window will close and they'll be sent to production. With luck, you'll be getting them before the next salvo of real-world tank events, so you can wear with pride. Also, I need to go back to the Patreon post and see who actually came up with this idea, so watch out for a PM from me. You're getting a free t-shirt. Anyway, to the questions. As normal, priority is to the Patreons, but I've taken a few from other sources as well, like YouTube comments, and I'm starting with Loch Ness Hamster. How dangerous is the muzzle blast of a tank's gun? Right, you don't want to be all that near to one. I seem to recall that 200 feet is potentially hazardous to anybody in the front sector of a modern 120mm cannon and lethal at about 20 feet. Correction, 50. For those sticking their heads out of a neighboring tank on the range, or even one's own tank, it helps that the majority of your body is actually inside the tank, but it is still an extremely significant impact on you, which you will feel. I have fired head out once, just for the experience, and I have no particular desire to repeat that experiment. It's a bit like when I took the gas mask off in the NBC chamber. It's kind of like, yeah, I didn't have to do it and I was stupid. I decided to try it anyway. So anyway, actually, come to think of it, there's quite a few things I've done in life that are really stupid and I decided to do them anyway, even if I knew it was stupid at the time. But experience is what teaches you. Anyway, for something a bit older on the subject of blast, the report on the blast of 17-pounder firing APCBC stated that prolonged close-range exposure, i.e. 20 feet from the muzzle, would produce considerable discomfort and temporary deafness. Now, what may be interesting is the exposure limit. You will recall from the Hulick video a couple of weeks ago that one is authorized to fire only 6 rounds of Carl G a day. Such limits also do exist for tanks, depending on the level of hearing protection that you have and whether you're inside or outside of the vehicle. The TC of a neighboring tank actually suffers a bit more from the blast than the TC of the firing tank. An exposed TC can shoot about 26 rounds of 829A3 a day, but it is unlikely a crewman inside the vehicle would ever fire enough rounds to be concerned. As an aside, the M1's manual also says how many minutes an hour you can go at any particular speed, depending on your level of hearing protection. Suffice to say, you really need to turn on your active noise reduction in your VIC-3s, and even at that, 92 miles in the day is considered the danger limit. I do suspect that these limits are generally ignored in wartime. The other problem you have are sabot pedals, as they obviously cannot be aimed, but will just go that away. The manual gives a danger area of about 1,000 meters long and 70 meters to each side of the gun target line for a 120mm as a general guide, and if firing 25mm sabot, that's an arc about 200 meters in distance and about 30 degrees each side of the gun. However, I am not sure I would trust to being 71 meters from the gun center line, and DAPAM 385-63 seems to have other figures up to 300 meter per side. There is a reason why master gunners go to gun school to sort these things out. Robert Henry Ilston. I've noticed a lot of heavy recovery vehicles spend a significant amount of time driving backwards, either getting into position or executing a rescue. I understand that many of these vehicles are built from existing hulls, but without the turret, or with a special turret. But has anyone ever built a purpose-designed track-to-roof recovery vehicle? Or one that utilizes tandem drivers, one facing forward and the other to the rear? Yes. As far as I know, there has only ever been one designed from the ground up tank recovery vehicle built, and that's the M88 built by Bowen McLaughlin York. People often think of it as a derivative of the M48 or the M60, but it isn't, as a good look at the whole shape will show you. It merely uses a number of the subcomponents which are also used by the tank, such as track and engine. During the design process, there was indeed consideration given to a rear-facing crew in addition to the front-facing, but the recommendation was to not do this, and so only the front configuration was built. If the ARV needs to extract the tank, they nose up to it. To my knowledge, it has not proven to be a drawback. Charles Charange. If there were a Mount Rushmore of tank-affiliated individuals, who would be on it? And we're not limited to the US. Okay. So the 4 presidents were selected because, from the artist's perspective, they represented the most important events or characteristics of the history of the US. Washington was selected as the father of the new country and represents the birth of the US. The logical counterpart then would be Hugh Ellis, the first commander of the Royal Tank Regiment. President number 2 is Thomas Jefferson, and he was selected to represent the growth of the US, since the Louisiana Purchase, like 15 states, happened under his watch. So, as a tank counterpart, I would nominate Jean-Baptiste Estienne. His concepts of massed amounts of concentrated small armor led to future doctrinal development, and also importantly, the FT that he helped design worked on proving the form factor, which led basically all subsequent tank development, and which also saw the basis of a number of tanks to be built around the world from the US to the USSR. Teddy Roosevelt was selected to represent the development of the US. And this poses quite the challenge, as tanks in their use were developed by anybody from Tukhachevsky to Lutz. However, since this is a Mount Rushmore we're talking about here, we will default to the Yank and go with Adna Chaffee Jr. Finally, Lincoln, to represent the preservation of the US. This is a little bit difficult, since I don't know if anybody has per se been responsible for the preservation of tanks as a concept. I mean, yeah, there are owners like Littlefield, or there are museum staff like Fletcher. But as a concept? The best I can come up with offhand is someone who used tanks to preserve their country. Arguably, if Israel Tal had failed, the country might not have been preserved. And so probably more than any other single tank officer, I will go with him. It's a shame that Oddball didn't make the grade though. And no, I don't plan to be at D-Day Conneaut this year. Competing events. He also wants to know what doctrine the M36s fell under in Korean service, because obviously tank destroyers were gone as a branch. Well, apparently they were used as light tanks. Though it does seem that the conversion didn't happen during the war, by the time they had left service in 1959, they were converted to have a whole machine gun. I don't see a coax port added, so it seems that that was the only machine gun added. They were eventually replaced by M47s. J. A known limitation of heavier tanks is/was that they require additional infrastructure to support them. This could be stronger bridges, special trucks, vehicle roadways, wider roadways, etc. Has there ever been work done to develop a disassemblable tank, which can be transported via normal infrastructure and then be reassembled close to the battlefield? Yes. And it will be to several levels. The most simple is to just make the tank a little bit narrower. Look at Tiger 1. Remove the outer set of road wheels and a track shield, put on a narrower transport track. It can now fit on your railway cars. Same with Churchill, which would have the air intakes, which are the big boxes on the side at the back. They could be removed for the same reason. And of course there's T-28 with its removable outer tracks. The only tank I can think of which was designed to be utterly disassembled for transport was the M22 Locust, but that was simply because the whole vehicle couldn't fit inside the one single transport aircraft and the turret got in the way for an underslung load. The entire vehicle, though, would be carried by that single transport. It was certainly possible, if necessary, to transport a tank in 2 pieces. It's how the Tiger, currently in Fort Benning, found its way across the Atlantic. Hull was transported separately to the turret in the hold of the same ship, but it is highly inconvenient. Plus, there is always the question of just how much disassembling would have been needed to have the Japanese take delivery of their Tiger by U-boat. These days, you generally see levels of modular armor packages, normally for air transport. Alexander H., congratulations on the promotion, thank you. You mentioned that it took a bit until you got the new rank. Can you explain the process? Right, sit down lads, this is going to take a while. First, I would refer you to the Many Armies of the United States video to refresh yourself with some of the details. So remember, I'm a National Guard officer, which means that I'm technically in a separate military right now to the federal US Army, regardless of what the US Army name tape says. I'm not subject to UCMJ. President Biden is not in my chain of command. I belong to the Texas Military Department and Governor Abbott. However, as the Guard can be mobilized into federal service, it makes sense for there to be very close cooperation between the Guard and the Federal Army. So with very few exceptions, which are normally at the very top level and aren't federalized routinely, you don't want to have a situation wherein a soldier at one rank can be mobilized only to discover that the Federal Army doesn't recognize you at that rank. As a result, the rank is not generally awarded until the federal military has approved the promotion to that rank in its own structure, be it by making sure the mandatory minimum requirements of time in service, time in grade, and education are made, and also by approval of Congress. Then there are two forms of promotion. You got unit vacancy promotion and Department of the Army Select. High-speed, low-drag folks can get promoted by unit vacancy. So you take a major, you throw him into a lieutenant colonel slot. Then you submit the paperwork to get him promoted, or her, to fit the position that he is in. And it can take quite a few months for the process to be completed. The effective date of the promotion is when the federal military says it's approved. Then there are a few unfortunate buggers who have specific Guard rank limitations, like AGRs, but that's not important in the large scheme of things. Says I, as a good friend of mine is finishing up his battalion command as a major. I went through the DA Select route because I'm not all that high-speed, low-drag. Every year or so, a group of officers in DC get together and they look at all the people who are in the zone for promotion to the next grade. They make a recommendation on whether or not they are fit for the next rank and submit the names for congressional approval, and when that comes back, they publish the DA Select list. I have absolutely no clue what percentage of officers who get considered get approved. In my case, I got boarded in February 2019. My name came out on the list in July 2019. However, just because the feds say I am worthy of promotion doesn't mean that the Guard agrees, and it also doesn't mean that I get promoted even if the Guard does agree. You still need to be in the slot on the table of organization. So there I sat until November of 2020. I was transferred to my current position in 1st Armored Division, which is a Lieutenant Colonel's slot. So now I enter the wonderful world of admin. I had to put a packet of paperwork together to be submitted to the State Personnel Office. The State Office eventually approved the promotion in February, and I received my state promotion order at that point. However, though Texas said I was Lieutenant Colonel, the Federal Army had not yet said that they agreed. They've only said that I should be one. So at this point, 99% of DA Select promotees will continue to wear the old rank until the paperwork comes back from DC. Plus, since I'm in a federal military unit and I was working on Fort Hood, it wouldn't have been permitted anyway, it wouldn't have been allowed. What happens on the state side of the fence is not the Federal Army's problem. Eventually, come mid-April, the paperwork comes back from DC saying that yes, the federal military agrees. I am now a Lieutenant Colonel in their system. I was at that point authorized to wear the new rank, but I held off on the insignia change until I could get promoted properly by the General commanding the division whose headquarters I was working in at the time. That said, folks on the other end of the telephone had no way of knowing what badge I was wearing, so I started throwing the silver leaf around immediately, and it's amazing how much more I was able to get done. The French in the division HQ, who didn't understand any of this, but knew I had the paperwork, just started me addressing as Colonel. Oh, and because the federal military had pre-approved my promotion by way of the DA selection board at the time I was transferred to the new position, the rank was backdated to November 2020 anyway, which was also a nice pay bonus. So there you go. That's why it took so long. It's to be noted that some promotions used to take nearly 2 years to go through the system, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Congress eventually got involved and told the Army to try to make it a little bit faster. Admiral Tiberius. With the Marines ditching their tanks and trying to acquire things like anti-ship missiles and other capabilities, is it possible we would see the return of something similar to the defense battalion concepts of the 1930s and 40s? Don't think so. The defense battalions were exactly what they sounded like. Defensive, generally static units, basically garrisons intended to provide anti-landing and anti-aircraft defense of critical locations. The modern Marine Corps isn't big enough to have units just hanging around waiting for somebody to attack them. I have not seen any manuals or doctrine yet for these new units, but I strongly suspect that they are going to be used in a more mobile offensive role, likely in smaller numbers, preying on singleton ships and generally being a nuisance to enemy infantry forces and logistical assets, and quite probably leaving immediately after the attack. Sim Crawford. Disregarding that it's a horses for courses sort of thing, if cornered for an answer, do I pick firepower, armor, or mobility? I pick armor, as the one to be deprioritized at the expense of the other two. However, as you say, it is a horses for courses thing, and it's also not a sliding scale as much as it is a stepping scale. So if you look at armor, for example, it isn't created just to be as thick as possible, or going to some arbitrary number of thickness, unless you're Hitler thinking that 8 centimeter is better than 6 centimeter for a Panther's front slope, because. In reality, there is a baseline level of protection which represents the most likely threat, and this is going to be gross simplification that I'm going to go into here, but bear with me. So, for example, the requirement is must protect against a 125mm gun. So let's say, for the sake of my little pea-brain mathematics, this means 20 centimeters of armor. The next most dangerous gun is a 115. Let's say that's 10 centimeters of armor. Let's also say that you're not happy with the level of mobility from a 20 centimeter armored tank, and you drop 2 centimeters of armor. You are now vulnerable to 125mm guns, but still invulnerable to 115. You've also improved your mobility by number out of posterior 5%. There is, however, no point to this sort of level of armor. You may as well drop it to 10 centimeters of armor, because you will still be protected against the same weapons that you would be at 18 centimeters of armor, but you've lost far more weight and thus gained far more mobility. This sort of thing is commonly enough found in US thinking in the archives. Kind of like, yeah, we could add a bit more armor to stop more than we currently stop, but what's the point? If we wanted to add enough armor to make a practical difference for the next level of gun, let's say, the tank will be so heavy that it loses all the other good characteristics. Similar can be said for guns. If the tank can kill a T-62 but not a T-72, then there's not much point in increasing firepower to the levels of somewhere between those two armor packages if it negatively affects any other characteristics. So, back to my earlier question. Don't get seen and don't get hit are further out of the survivability onion than don't get penetrated. I'm not actually a fan of relying on the armor in general. I view it more as a saving throw for when a mistake has been made. There are some exceptions in the heavy tank role, though. Caleb Engelhart. When I commanded an Abrams, what were your regular maintenance tasks? Did you ever emphasize a particular smaller task in order to avoid having to do a more unpleasant one? Well, the regular maintenance tasks are those spelled out in the -10. The process is called preventative maintenance checks and services. Or first and last parades, or before and after operational service checks, depending on your country. Yeah, let's see, something fell off. There we go. Let's clip that back in. Okay, so PMCS in the manual. On the M1A1, and they look kind of like this, there are 130 of these checks all told. Of these, 42 are conducted before you set off. 4 are things to keep in mind as you're roaming around, 68 are performed when you're done, 6 are checked weekly, and 10 monthly. And these are the crew level tasks. Then you get the maintenance level stuff like semi-annual or annual services. Some of these tasks take longer than others. For example, check that the fire extinguisher handle is not pulled out is a step. It's actually number 2, I think. So is check for loose end connectors or wedge bolts, which takes quite a few minutes. In practice overseas, we tended to do a daily abbreviated check of the really important stuff like track, fluids, leaks, weapons check, and an MRS update, and that would take maybe a half hour before the mission. We also had a weekly maintenance day where the tank would be gone over in far more detail to include rebore sighting. The only time I can recall that we ever said sod it, we're not doing that, was for track pad replacement. Replacing 312 track pads on a tank is annoying, especially in Iraq heat. We just decided it was easier to simply replace the whole track and let somebody else deal with refurbishing the rubber. Gary Nielsen, why is the gunner the 2IC of a US tank, but the loader operator in a British one? I don't know if I've specifically seen anything on the matter. It's been a few years since I've been to the British Army's tank school, actually 2006. And at the time, at least, upon induction, a new recruit would be selected to either be a driver or a gunner, and would undertake the course of training appropriately. The loader is, indeed, the second in command, the thinking being that he can assist the commander because he's got a good overview of what the tank is doing from his relatively detached position. He can see the whole turret and the crew, he can see the terrain around him, and he can easily take over controlling the tank if the TC suddenly gets busy doing platoon things on the map and radio or whatever. On the other hand, the US philosophy is that the new guy is almost always the loader. In this position, he can learn quickly because he can see what everyone else is doing, whilst also being able to see the terrain and maybe understand why the tank is doing what the tank is doing. Then he's put down to the driver's position, then the gunner is arguably the most technical. By the time a tanker is in the gunner's seat, he's probably seen a lot of the traps or common malfunctions and so can handle them himself, as well as being fully familiar with the tank operations so that he can handle the gun and turret without too much oversight. So it's not as if there is no logic at all to either position. I guess both work. Larry Brown, compare the logistical needs of a World War II platoon of tanks with those of a current platoon. Well, it'll vary hugely depending on what's going on. A tank sitting in a defensive position with the APU running is going to use a lot less fuel in a day than a tank bounding across Western Europe. But what would you say if I told you that an M1 Abrams tank platoon might use less fuel than a Sherman tank platoon? No, I wouldn't have believed it either, at least not until I started looking into the figures. Of course, a big reason for this is that an M1 platoon is 4 tanks and a Sherman platoon 5. But even at that, it depends on what you're doing, and it is surprising considering the reputation M1 has as a gas guzzler. So, as you can see from this table, whichever side I put it up, a Sherman would run about 3 gallons to the mile cross country and about 1.5 gallons to the mile on the road. Of course, no tank is ever doing only one thing or spend all their day doing one speed. In the mid-1990s, the thinking was that in operation, a tank is running 10 to 13 hours of the day. Of this, 85% of the time is spent at idle, 10% moving in secondary roads, maybe about 25 miles an hour, and 5% cross-country, doing about 17. But even then, things change. The turbine, for example, used to suck down over 11 gallons an hour just sitting there, though a new electronic control unit in the late 90s dropped it to 9. Today, with working APUs, it's far less than that. Cross-country in the 90s, you're looking at about 4 gallons to the mile or 2.5 gallons to the mile on a road. Overall then, this meant that Armour Branch estimated a use of between 175 to 230 gallons a day per tank. By the time you get to the A2 SEP V2, you're looking at under 2 gallons to the mile at 29 miles an hour and about 0.58 or so miles per gallon at 25 to 27 miles an hour. I have no unclassified data to share on the current V3 or current A2 cross-country. It's an interesting example though of how the M1's fuel efficiency has improved over time, even though the engine itself basically is the same, and the tank has also been getting heavier. So at this point, with a modern tank, you're within about 10% of the road fuel economy of an M4A1, and a little bit further going to an M4A3 whilst going 5 to 10 miles an hour faster than the Sherman. Cross-country, I suspect it would be even more interesting if we could find the figures, because improvements in gearing, torque and suspension would mean that the M1 would negotiate quickly obstacles which might cause an M4 to slow to walking pace and then scream at full revs for however long it takes the tank to get out of low gear. There is unfortunately nothing I can find for the idle consumption rate of the M4, so in the pre-APU days it's pretty much inarguable that an M4 unit would suck less fuel on regular operations. But once the APU comes along, that argument actually drops dramatically. Also, the M1 is noted for not being the most fuel efficient tank overall, so if anyone with reliable Leopard figures, for example, wants to throw them at me, I'll come back to this next month. All that, unfortunately, though, merely covers the fuel consumption. Oil consumption we can probably leave alone as it's not all that huge, but then there's a problem of measuring the amount of spare parts. If the figures for those exist anywhere, I couldn't tell you. I can tell you that a 1990s armoured division was supposed to roam around with a war stockage of approximately 400 tons of M1 spare parts, and that's somewhere over 1.25 tons per tank. But I cannot give a similar figure for World War II, and neither can I account for supplies requested at higher levels, like core workshops, or supplies which are just delivered on demand. As for ammunition, there is a paper written for CGSC which estimates that on the experience in 1991, the modern army needs only 8% of the tank ammunition of World War II to achieve similar results, although of course the modern ammunition is still much bigger. Mike Quinton, how many M1A2 SEP V3s are to be built? The contracts are still ongoing, but the last I've seen as of early last year is 2,101. That said, it seems that the contract is a sort of a crossover one, which when approved will instead be switched to putting SEP V4s off the production line. So it's really more a case of the Army is upgrading its entire current fleet of M1A2s to at least SEP V3 standard. Interestingly, the announcements seem to be quiet on the exact specifics of the remaining M1A1s still found in some National Guard units, but the Army does say that the plan is for them all to be divested by 2025, which by default implies the intent that the entire Army, active and reserve fleets, will be A2 V3s by 2026. Also, am I going to go film at the museum in Belvoir? No, it's not on my current list of places to film. Indeed, I haven't even visited it yet, which I probably need to do at some point. Hammer of Terror. Is motion sickness common amongst tankers? I wouldn't say common, but it's certainly not unheard of either. So motion sickness is basically caused by there being a disconnect between what your eyes are seeing and what your inner ear's motion sensors are telling you. If you're inside a tank and you can only see the inside of the tank, which is generally stationary relative to you, then as the tank is moving around, you have such a disconnect. Similarly, if you're looking through the gunner's sight and the system is stabilized and you're looking at what is, in effect, a fairly still image, as you are seated, whilst your inner ear is saying that you're turning left, traveling sideways to the right and bouncing up and down. As a result, thus, normally the gunner gets it worst, whilst the driver, TC, and normally loader are looking out at the outside world without augmentation, so their eyes are telling them that there is, yes, some movement. Also, can a low-calibre cannon such as 20mm Flak 38 stun a tank crew sufficiently that they could not get a return shot off? Answer is a qualified yes. As you're driving along in a combat zone, any loud, sudden noises will attract your attention and raise your adrenaline levels. And the fact that somebody is shooting at you indicates that the enemy has seen you early enough to get the first shot off and has the range. Something bigger very well may be following along, if the repeated impacts don't find a weak point. The receiving tank may pull off a hurried shot or withdraw. In Operation Think Tank, Hilary Doyle observed that a surprisingly effective weapon was the MG151/20 drilling, a triple 20mm mount, and the troops were looking for every one that they could get their hands on. However, A very determined or experienced crew will probably get the incoming fire to stop by way of a well-placed outbound round. Spencer Loper. Was there ever consideration regarding an interruption of fuel with regards to the turbine engine tanks, or was it just assumed that the war would end so quickly, either due to maneuver or nuking, that it was irrelevant? Interruption of normal fuel supplies is the reasoning behind the idea of multi-fuel engines. The turbine on the M1 will run on pretty much anything that the tank crew will find, albeit with differing levels of efficiency. However, if the fuel is being deliberately hit, then the turbine tanks are probably the least of the problems, because there's far more in an army that requires fuel, like trucks and IFVs, as supplies, than there are tanks. Although I have no doubt that the people in charge have indeed considered such things, I guess they figured it wasn't worth caring over. That said, of course, it is worth noting that the Russians did conclude that the consumption on the T-80 was not worth the hassle, but I think that was more an efficiency thing for the situation, not a we can't get fuel at all to run them thing. Thunderchild. Had Operation Unthinkable actually occurred, would it have made more sense to keep the Germans in German tanks or re-equip the Germans with Allied tanks, or a mixture of both? Probably a mixture of both, a bit like the British had during the war. As long as the resources were around to keep the vehicles in the field, especially from units which surrendered before the vehicles were lost, it would make sense to have units which already know the vehicles and keep them, instead of having them take the time to pull out of the line, retrain to new American, let's say, equipment, and then go back in. What the German factories will be doing other than making spare parts is a little more of an interesting question though. So should Sturmgeschütz, Panzer IV or Jagdpanzer production keep going, since the factories were present, operational and tooled up for it? If US supplies can meet demand, I would say there might be merit to stopping them from making those particular tanks and instead making other vehicles, such as anti-aircraft, gun tractors, or recovery vehicles. However, that's just my answer after thinking about it for less than 5 minutes. The question on continuing to manufacture Panther would be particularly interesting, and I do think there is an argument for doing so, albeit at a lower rate of production to ensure quality control and a higher availability of repair parts. And do I have a favorite Thunderbird from the TV show? Now, that excludes Thunderbird 6, which was a de Havilland Tiger Moth, and that was from a movie. So I guess I will just stick with the utilitarian Thunderbird 2. Matthew Lesich. Which Xenos faction in Warhammer 40k has the best tanks and why? I'm afraid the options here are limited, as tracks seem to be limited in use outside of the Empire. The squats have a land train, which is all tracked, and it does have merit as a result, but they are abhumans, not Xenos. Thus, as far as I know, and my knowledge of 40k lore is limited, that leaves only the orcs as the other track users. Tau or Eldar may have better tanks, but they are being ignored due to the lack of tracks. You cannot tension a repulsor. Jordan Peterson. Me and my flatmate are fans of the channel. Oh, thank you. And one comment in an old video started a discussion between us. In the video, you said that towards the end of the war, the US were getting tanks that were perhaps closer to what the Germans wanted at the start of the war, which got us thinking. How would things have changed if the Germans had had those tanks? Realistically, I'm not sure it would have made much difference in the long run. You still can't outproduce the USSR and USA. However, it would have been an interesting thought exercise. What would have happened, let's say, had Kursk not been delayed to allow for the arrival of Panthers and Ferdinand? But instead, what if production had been kept to the more reliable Panzer IIIs and IVs? After all, the Germans conquered France with supposedly inferior tanks to the enemy there. Panzer IIs and IIIs going up against Sommers and Charbys, were effectively the Shermans and T-34s going up against Tigers and Panthers. Yet they obviously wiped the floor with the opposition. And of course we know how the end result of the overall war went for the side with the biggest tanks. Note, this is a slightly different question to the matter of producing more of the smaller tanks than the bigger. Germany was never going to be able to manufacture enough to make a difference, but the question is whether those lesser but reliable tanks, well handled earlier in the conflict, might have had more of an effect than the Cats several months later. Given the amount of time that the Soviets had to allow for preparing a reception for the Germans at Kursk, for example, there was something to be said for the argument. In the long run, of course, there are still the issues of petroleum supply, US and Soviet production, and fighting on multiple fronts. So, long term though, no matter. Jordan did ask a supplemental question of whether Allied tanks would have changed as a response, and I'm inclined to think no, not in large part. The US would still have made Sherman to the same schedule, including the 76mm upgrades, and the British would have made Cromwell. These tanks were created with own side requirements in mind, not as responses to the opposition. Arguably, the Soviets would have still made the IS as well, if nothing else just to handle the towed anti-tank guns, even if the big vehicles with the big guns were not being manufactured. Mr. Carl, every M1917 light tank I have ever seen has at least one plate with bullet impact marks. I guess that they would build a tank and then shoot at it to confirm that the armor is sound. Why on earth did they not batch test? Wouldn't doing a live test on your tank risk compromising the armor? And when did the army decide that shooting every finished tank was a foolish exercise? Not just one plate. From the 1917s I've seen every plate had 2 impact marks from a rifle. What I've been told, and I have no information to verify but also no reason to deny, is that metallurgical testing by way of the use of equipment to test Allied composition and strength had not yet been invented. So shooting at the plate was the only reliable form of quality control in the US. Any metallurgical scientists, feel free to chime in the comments below, and I will come back to it next month if you have information to add. In the meantime, I guess they stopped when they were able to implement some form of metal composition analysis. Michael Prothero, why didn't they develop a 120mm smoke round for the smoothbore tank cannon? As near as I can tell, mainly because no tank can use it. The payload of a typical smoke shell is white phosphorus. It's a sort of a semi-gelatinous liquid. I think HC smoke has something similar. But anyway, this means that smoke rounds have to be stored vertically. But almost every 120mm carrying tank, Abrams, Leopard, Leclerc, Type 10, Merkava, etc., carries the ammunition horizontally. In which case the liquid is going to settle to one side of the round and unbalance it. The one exception seems to be Ariete, which does have a few rounds stowed on end. But I guess nobody thought it was worth developing a rarely used round for the 200 or so of those tanks made. As an aside, there was a proposal to make a 120mm breech loading mortar using the M256, and the rounds for that would have been standard mortar rounds mated to the 120mm casing, much like early HE rounds for the tank gun were, but obviously that didn't go anywhere. Adam Schindler, considering all the ideas for machine guns and tanks used over the years, how would you arrange the guns and apportion the crew to serve them in World War II, mid-Cold War, and today? Well, World War II is an interesting one because obviously one has to look at the bow gunner. Almost every tank which could have one did, so there must have been some merit to it at the time. However, I have found some reference that, at least in the US Army, the desire for the bow gun was because it was something which could be fired when the tank was on the move, at least by units that didn't keep their stabilizers operational. This was, of course, a feature specific to the Sherman, so doesn't help with the other tanks which had bow machine guns. So on an M4 at least, I would ditch the bow gunner and ensure the troops were trained on the use and maintenance of the stabilizer. Give the caliber 30 to the loader, let the TC keep the caliber 50 up front. There were quite a few designs for Under Armour caliber 50 for the TC as well, incidentally. Honestly, I think that's quite a sensible design for mid-Cold War as well. The Soviets had a slightly different philosophy with their attitude to the AA gun though, the 12-7. You will note that they tended to give that to the loader, presumably on the basis that the loader wasn't likely to be engaging in main gun operations at times when they're under air attack. or at least that it was more important for the TC not to be distracted at such times than the loader. The idea has some merit. I'm not thrilled by the 50 caliber Mt weapon station placement on the M1A2 up front. Most other countries have decided that their RWS should be someplace other than right in front of the TC, and frankly I'm inclined to agree with them. I would also give the control to the loader. I suspect that he has a bit more room and a bit more time. I have this niggling recollection that the Marines did try a remote weapon station on some of their M1A1s and that the loader was in control of it. But I will also observe that the CWS on the M1A1 was not an issue, it's far smaller. S-Face. Other than Hitler, what instances of executive meddling in the design of weapon systems were there? Nothing is blatant, I don't think, but certainly there are influences which are occasionally less than rational. For example, 1961, Marshal Chuikov, commander of the Soviet ground forces, was being briefed that the British were about to field a 105mm rifle tank gun and it was going to go on British, French, German and American tanks. At the time, the standard Soviet MBT had the 100mm. He was not pleased with this and wanted to know if the Soviet engineers had anything bigger. Enter the 115mm, which he demanded be placed into service even if they had to strap it to the back of a pig. As a side note, this chap commanded Soviet forces in Stalingrad and he could be a little bit strong-willed. T-62 was accepted for service later that summer. The American T-92 light tank, of course, was nailed by the fact that the Soviets had just released PT-76, which could swim, and T-92 could not. Actually, T-92 had a number of other faults, which I will get around to one day in another video, but they may possibly have been rectified. The lack of swimming, however, could not be. But Sheridan could swim. The British had their own version, I guess. Churchill instructed that 500 of the new infantry tank A-22, i.e. what would soon become known as the Churchill tank, would be built by March of 1941. This was done about June of 1941, this instruction, when the tank hadn't been designed, let alone trialled. As a result, the tank was ordered straight into production without even a pilot or testing program, which led to the first tanks being perhaps less than stellar. In none of those cases, however, was the politician directly interfering with the design. The engineers were still generally in charge of doing that. TN Sheep. Will we get an inside the hatch on the Oscar Meyer Weinermobile? Not on my current list of priorities, though I guess it could be a target of opportunity should it be near one. You might have more luck asking Doug DeMura that one. Couldn't. In War Thunder, one often has to shoot a tank multiple times to sort of finish off the crew. Is that considered a war crime? Or at least, what is the standard? No. Generally, it wouldn't be considered a war crime, but it's also a case of it not being entirely clear-cut. The rule is simple enough. You cannot shoot somebody who is hors de combat, and the common example given is somebody who is ejected from his airplane. It might thus be considered that a tank crew bailing from their tank are similarly placed hors de combat. There is, though, a big difference in that it is effectively impossible for a parachuting pilot to indicate surrender, and it is a crime to shoot anybody that you have identified as expressing a desire to surrender. Someone bailing from a tank may be able to express such a desire. The catch is that there's likely a short period of time in between when he's bailing and when he's actually indicating surrender, during which he might get killed. And there is not very much which can be done about that. As for crews who remain inside a knocked out tank, it's not unexpected to put a few more rounds into a knocked out tank until it starts to burn, because that way you know for sure it's been knocked out. Matthew Sears, what are my opinions on technicals? I.e. Toyota Hiluxes with a machine gun slash cannon slash recorderless rifle slash rocket pod slash tank turret on the back. What would I go with if I wanted to cobble one together? Well, they do seem to work. What would I go with? Well, I mean, I guess by default you start with a Hilux. Although if you're going to go to war, I don't see why it couldn't be done in some luxury. So maybe you get a pickup with a high trim option, like an F350 Limited or a Ram 1500 Limited. I'm sure there's a way of getting some armor sheet into the doors. There's probably little wrong with the ZPU 4 on the back, although if you want to go old school, the M45 Quad 50 I'm sure would fit nicely in the truck bed, and it's powered. Better yet, get also the gun shield from the Korean War era M16s and you're sorted. Right, if you are wondering about the sudden lighting change, it's because about 4 hours ago the kids came home, my mom came home, we had to go out to dinner, and all sorts of other things happened, and my batteries ran out, and whatever, the joys I have filming at home. But I continue without missing a beat because of the magic of editing. Sebastian Cronin. Looking at newer IFVs like Lynx and Ascot, they prioritise armour and especially mine protection at the cost of size and weight. How survivable is a 40-ton, 3.5 metre tall in a high-end conflict? Probably more survivable than a 30-ton, 3 metre tall IFV, but that's not necessarily saying much. Modern IFVs and APCs are big. Really, really big. Someone suggested that in answer to the Ajax problem to just use Boxer in the role with the turret up top, but if they thought Ajax was big, they'd be stunned by the wheeled vehicle, so compare to an M1 from the Australian competition. Frankly, I don't understand why vehicles approaching the weight of tanks haven't been common before now. In terms of size, physical size, if a modern fire control system can reliably hit a 3 metre tall tank at 3 kilometres, being 3.5 meters tall isn't going to make a heck of a lot of practical difference. You may as well start looking at armour if the engines can take it. It used to be that an IFV will be armoured to protect against other IFVs, such as the Bradley being armoured to stop BMP-2's 30mm autocannon. But it always struck me that there was a bit of an unfounded assumption that the enemy tanks would only shoot at friendly tanks and only enemy IFVs would shoot at friendly IFVs. And will it just ignore everything else on the battlefield that might take a pot shot at one? So cue that sign on the side in 50 languages saying, "I am a troop carrier, not a tank, please don't shoot at me." As for mobility, given that IFVs aren't supposed to be going anywhere that the tanks aren't really, the whole combined arms thing, you're going to need the bridge infrastructure for the tanks, so you may as well raise the IFV limit to match. In any case, even 30mm autocannon ammunition has improved over the last half century, but you have other issues like explosive form penetrators, roof armor concerns and the like. So it seems that to have the same overall percentage chance of survival, more armor is going to be required anyway. Kazuki K. Considering that the US is retiring the Styker MGS, this leaves a hole in the US arsenal when it comes to a vehicle more portable and mobile than an MBT. What is the US military's plan with respect to light tanks or cannon IFV development? Well, the plan is Mobile Protected Firepower Program, which is either going to be a reworked M8 AGS or an Ajax with a big gun. Yes, the chassis is actually a wheel shorter, I know. I guess they just didn't need the extra length, but it is an Ajax chassis. It is to be noted that the loss of MGS is really only a loss with the Striker units, in as much as it could do an assault role which the Carl Gustaf couldn't. I don't know if anybody in Strikerland is actually lamenting the loss of the vehicle. I don't hang out in those circles very much. Thus, similarly, the MPF isn't really going to fill the gap in vehicle capability, which is filled by, say, BMP or ZBL-08 with a large cannon. The US seems to think right now that there is just no need to fill such a gap because of all the other assets that the Army can bring to bear. Go back to the previous Q&A where I go over all the various things that have to happen before a new piece of equipment is requested. Is there really a need for the role outside of the air mobile one that MPF is to fill? Also, have I any plans to talk about the Battlefield 3 Thunder Run? No, I cannot say that I've had any such. In fact, I was never even aware that the level existed until he asked the question, so I had a gander at a walkthrough, and I'm wondering various things like why the Marines seem to be driving A2s, why the gunner's sight is on the left-hand side of the cannon, why the fire control computer seems to be out of service, why they're instructed to remain stationary when under artillery barrage, why the heat round the guy loads looks a heck of a lot like an MPAT, the ready rack seems to be stupidly big, and let's not even talk about the symbology. In fact, no, I have no plans on wasting any more of my time on that. Something I do enjoy wasting time on, though, is shooting, which brings us back to Gun of the Month after a bit of an absence. And I am going to be continuing on with the Irish theme with a BAP. The Browning Automatic Pistol, or realistically, the Browning High Power. Now, this, unfortunately, is a Mark III. Unfortunately, I mean, I like new guns because I'm going to shoot them and want them to be reliable and accurate. Of course, the Irish Army did not use Mark IIIs, and there's no lanyard loop at the bottom, no drain hole at the front, so very definitely not a Mark II. However, it is, to all intents and purposes, a Browning High Power, which would have been a standard Irish service pistol until replaced by the USP about 15-20 years ago, if that long. Couple of interesting features. So firstly, you will note that the magazine doesn't just slide out, it launches out because there's a little spring at the bottom of the mag. And I don't know why more pistols don't use it. So if you're holding it vertically, it really just shoots out. So no problems with sticking mags when releasing. It does, of course, also have the infamous magazine safety. So magazine is out, nothing happens. Safety is about, well, let's see, from here to here, push it inside, it presses against here, and the thinking is, A, don't trust soldiers, they're idiots and they will point the pistol at themselves or somebody else when they think it's empty, and pull the trigger, which is a simple matter of training. And unfortunately, this is also the reason why California has decided to mandate magazine disconnects or magazine safeties in all their pistols. And say again? Okay, you didn't need to announce that. I'm sorry. We continue. And the other argument for a mag disconnect is if you're in furious hand-to-hand combat and somebody is about to disarm you, if you hit the mag release, then they cannot shoot you with your own gun. I think this is also a spurious argument, and if it wasn't for the fact that I just don't like mucking with things very much, and I think in one or two guns in a month to come you'll see that I'm not totally averse to mucking with things, but this one I'm not going to muck with. A lot of people simply disconnect the mag disconnect. Disconnect the mag. Magazine safety disconnect, whatever the heck you want to call it. Now, I am on record as being a bit of a heretic in that I have said that I am not a huge fan of St. Browning's 1911. I'm not going to say not a fan, but I prefer the 240 to the M2, the Browning 50 cal, as a tank weapon. I realize I am rare in tankers and that, but it is not that I do not appreciate Browning's work at all. And the high power, I appreciate. It's got a couple of neat little usability features. Yes, wife. Son of a bitch. Okay, yeah, all right, doesn't matter. And it's down to little even quality of life issues. So for example, there's a little notch back here that when you want to disassemble it, first take the magazine out, it makes it a lot easier. You can pull back and you can lock with the safety catch. You can lock the slide to the rear, which then makes removing the slide lock and pin much easier. And out it comes. I mean, the slide and spring, you look at it, it looks like any other pistol you see more or less these days. It is a modern pistol design. Single action only, which is a bit of a problem because it's an interesting size. It's not quite a full-size pistol, but it's not a compact. And because it's a single action only, it's not one that I'm going to use as a carry pistol. It's not worth it. It is fundamentally still a 90-odd-year-old design. But I will say it shoots wonderfully. It's very accurate. 13 rounds in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber. It is, well, let's just say you will not go wrong if this is the weapon with which you must save your life. So that said, end of gun of the month. Grim, do fin-stabilised saber rounds spin in flight? The answer is yes, and it's actually something of a balance, because if you put too much spin, you hit the Magnus effect, and that's the same sort of effect which makes a curveball curve. I'm sure it can be ultimately countered by the ballistic computer, but why make it difficult? However, if you put no spin on there at all, then if there's any aerodynamic or mass asymmetry, i.e. if it's not perfectly built, then the round isn't going to go quite where you think. So there is actually a teensy little bit of cant on the fin. And if you're thinking about half of a degree, you won't be far off. Gorodekage. Do I still travel abroad? And if so, is it more difficult to travel to Russia, especially given my military background? Would I do an inside the hatch on Kugelpanzer? I suspect that there's nothing inside Kugelpanzer to display. However, yes, it is more difficult. COVID killed my planned trips to Russia and Brazil. So far, my military background, though it is required to state on the Russian visa application to include any combat deployments, has not been a problem in Russia. However, the entire globe seems to have been shut down, so I've got Belgium and Germany on my to-go list as well. I'm hopeful to go to Canada in September for a keynote, but the way the COVID thing is going right now, it's resurging. I'm beginning to wonder if the border will even be open by then. Frankly, I can't even seem to get the Benning. I was hoping to do some filming there last week, but stuff happened, and I ended up missing my connector from Houston, and I couldn't get to Benning at a reasonable hour the next day, so I just gave up and went home. I am planning on trying again in a couple of weeks. Felicity Longus. In the past, I have stated that artillery is one of the most frightening things a tanker can encounter. There is little to protect from cluster munitions blanketing an entire group of tanks with submunitions. Was this always the case? Was artillery in the indirect role still such a menacing threat to armor before the advent of DPICM and the like? Yes and no. I am sure it was still just as frightening. You got a steel rain coming down on you, never knowing if a 150 or a 105 round will impact on the roof just inches above your head. Indeed, it is worth observing that one of the Zebra Pershings had the TC's hatch blown off by a 150 round exploding nearby. The rest of the tank wasn't too happy about it either. However, a little bit like air power at the time, the psychological effect is a little bit nastier than the practical effect. Indirect artillery would certainly strip armor of their accompanying infantry, making an attack, if continued, and often they weren't, a little bit more nerve-wracking for the crews, but it would rarely actually stop a tank. That said, the CEO of Able 645th Tank Destroyer Battalion claimed 11 tanks and 2 SPGs by calling an artillery fire on them in Anzio, though the impression I got was that they were stationary. Seb Cronin again. It looks like the British have hit a snag with Ajax. A recent report reads, successful delivery of the program to time, cost and quality appears to be unachievable. Furthermore, warrior upgrade plans have been axed. Ought the UK stick it out and complete Ajax, or is it time to buy something else? They'll probably stick it out, honestly. From listening to the parliamentary inquiry, it seems that it's up to GDLS to deliver the vehicles to the fixed price. If they don't get much of a profit, that's their problem, not the British government's. It seems that there are two major issues which are grabbing attention: noise and vibration. The noise problems seem to be a compatibility issue between the Army's headset system and the vehicle, given the use of other headsets hasn't caused issues. It's probably going to be fixed by some rerouting of wiring and shielding. The vibration issue may be a little bit harder to deal with, assuming it actually is real and not perceived issue. I mean, we're talking about a 45-ton tracked vehicle, it's going to vibrate. Depending on what's causing the vibration, it may or may not be relatively simple to fix, now that public attention has been drawn to it. That said, I have not seen anyone say that the vehicle is incapable of doing the tactical job for which it was intended, especially if those two problems are fixed, so I don't see any huge merit to throwing it off and starting over. Minion, just been watching Rob Cogan and me waxing lyrical in Harmony Church. Where does the name Harmony Church come from? I have no idea. I'll have to find out and get back to you. Peter Anderson, when I have a sensing session with the Joes, does it begin with, "Greetings all, it's time for another Q&A"? No, it's generally, "Right so," or, as evidenced by my Hewlett video, "Good morning." They had me read out the official order for urinalysis test last time out, and Top was apparently in the back trying to laugh, not to laugh his arse off, and I really don't see why. I mean, it's something that the Army takes very seriously. Probably not as cheerfully as I do, though. Van Owen, are there automatic track tensioning systems? Not that I'm aware of. The best I've seen are spring-loaded ones, like those little tension idlers found on the backs of some post-war US tanks. These days, the same job is done by a connection between the number one road wheel and the idler. As the wheel goes up and shortens the track run, the idler pushes forward to tension it up again. Nothing like that on the back though, but I suspect it's because the sprocket keeps that part of the track under good tension. Since a properly tensioned system shouldn't throw much, I'm not sure whether it's worth the cost of implementing a fully automatic system. The mechanically assisted track tension system, such as on Challenger 2, however, where you just move a lever to increase or decrease the tension, is very nice. Also, how's the modeling going? Did I ever finish the Type 97? No. I simply haven't had the time. My order of priority right now is the master's degree work, YouTube requirements, family. With family sometimes beating YouTube. Modeling is not really getting much of a foothold recently. Sean Davis, what is my opinion on the Australian acquisition of M1A2 SEP V3, including bridging and assault variants of the M1? Also, as they're likely going to stuff a fridge and aircon into the new tanks, like the old ones, would the US be willing to add some creature comforts to the fleet? Well, after I mused upon this the last time, 1 or 2 Q&As ago, wondering what they needed the V3s for, given that the A1s seemed likely to deal with pretty much anything in the area, or anything likely to be in the area for the foreseeable future, I received a pretty informative email from an Aussie in the know, and it turns out it's the Aussies playing the long game. With only Egypt, with their own production lines, being another M1A1 user once the US gets rid of theirs in a couple of years, that means that there is no longer a US-led and funded maintenance and update plan for the tank. So either the Aussies would have had to pay for the development, or they'd be stuck with what they had. By going with the V3s, they retain compatibility with the US and its vehicle developments, and they also have a vehicle which is specifically designed to be greatly upgradable in the future. So, from the long-term perspective, it actually does make sense. As for the support vehicles, that also makes sense. If you have the tanks, a weapon of maneuver, one is deliberately hobbling oneself if the appropriate enablers for that maneuver are not present. As for the aircon and fridge, well, I can't see the US Army shelling out for it. Heck, it took decades for us to get a boiling vessel. That said, if the funds are available at the unit level, I wouldn't be surprised if kit wouldn't be available through the system. I noted, for example, that the Sunshade that the Aussies had on their tanks also had an NSN, a national stock number, which means that you can basically order it through the system. So maybe a unit could get 1 fridge per tank platoon or something like that. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning. You're late for gun of the month. Oh well. In the 1985 Red Dawn Senario, the US military has received a flood of World War II Korea vehicles from collectors, VFW points, etc. We're looking at M3 half-tracks, DUKWs, tank destroyers, Stuarts, Shermans, M4A1s, the works, which, if any, could be made combat capable enough to be useful within a month or less, assuming ammunition is not a problem. Could they be fitted with more modern weapons? Are they better than no tank at all? Or are they just more trouble than they are worth? More trouble than they'd be worth, but not because of any inherent problems with the vehicles. Look at the timeline. What is happening to the US's vehicle fleet in 1985? The M60s are almost removed from regular army service and are being cascaded down to the National Guard units, which are still using M48s or earlier M60s. That means that the Army has a massive fleet of M48s, mainly A5s, recently removed from service and now sitting in storage fleets in places like Sierra Army Depot, awaiting further disposition. Similarly, look at the personnel carriers. Bradley is coming into service and knocking out M113s and IFVs, which are also cascading back to the US. With those vehicles available, what's the point of dealing with the mishmash of other vehicles being dragged out? Now, of course, there is some precedent to grabbing vehicles out of museum to fight, and I'm talking about by the government, not just by a group of rebels who grab a tank as a monument. In 1991, the British realized that they were getting into a war where there was a gap in between when tracked Rapier was being removed from service and before its replacement was able to enter service. As a result, they raided museums and gate guards to find vehicles, refurbished them, and sent them off into the desert. Plus, of course, a few old tanks from Bovington were being used in case Germany invaded in 1940. Jackson Fox. What countries use the M45 quad mount besides US, Israel, and USSR? Well, if you're counting the M60 and half-track, you're France, Germany, Belgium, Japan, Philippines, Portugal, South Korea, Thailand, and Netherlands. I'm not actually sure the quad mount was used by USSR as opposed to the twin mount, though. The ground mount was modified by Columbia to fit onto the M8 armored cars. Apparently, it was more as a counterinsurgency weapon for dealing with ambushes as opposed to as an anti-aircraft weapon. Jenny R. Whilst the US tank destroyer branch was dissolved shortly after the end of World War II, the German Panzerjäger branch persisted in the Bundeswehr, fielding independent battalions in the 1980s and not being dissolved as a branch until 2006. What factors led to the difference in decisions? Not actually as much as you might think. Indeed, the Panzerjäger Trooper were equipped with M41, M47 and even M48 tanks before moving to purpose-built vehicles. From what I can tell, although they were organized administratively as battalions, in practice they were distributed as companies to brigades, and later, in the Cold War, a company would be assigned to a mech infantry battalion. In this then, there would be no difference really between a German mech infantry battalion in Martyrs or M113s supported by a company of Jaguars, and an American mech infantry battalion in M113s supported by a company of M901 ITVs. The difference is administrative. The Germans kept their tank hunters as a different branch, while the Americans kept them as a different MOS with an infantry branch, and the ITV company was an integral part of the infantry battalion instead of as an attachment. Reichsbeerminister. And you know, you have me half believing that that was a real position back then. Oh well. What happens inside a tank if it gets penetrated? In many games and some films, it is depicted as, well, this actually wasn't much of a problem, the crew just changes out to wounded or dead and keeps on fighting. Is this reality? What is the protocol in this sort of situation? Now, protocol and what actually happens may not necessarily be the same thing. Having a crewman die in the tank with you is most likely an extremely unsettling experience, and it wouldn't be beyond surprising for the crew to stop fighting while they deal with the shock, especially depending on the nature of the casualty. The official protocol is that you configure for a 3-man crew, which usually means the TC performs the gunner's operations. In World War II, the bow gunner would move up into the turret. However, there is just as much chance, if the tank can't reverse quickly or pop smoke, that the crew would bail out, as opposed to trying to stay in a tank for which the enemy obviously has both the range and a gun which can penetrate. Seb Cronin again. The year is 2000. With the Cold War over, Elbonia now finds itself able to buy almost any surplus military vehicle at once. The problem is that the chap in charge of army procurement is the secret grandson of the now executed traitor who had held this position 55 years earlier. Eager to avenge his grandfather, what vehicles, and he has a list, would you buy in order to ensure Elbonia's secret obsolescence in the new millennium. I think I'm going to implement a policy similar to Ian, and I'm only going to start taking these "you are in charge of" procurement questions on an exceptional basis. However, I will mention this one anyway. And it's actually extremely difficult, because by the end of the late Cold War period, all the vehicles in service are generally at the tail end of a long development and break-in period. Finding a true lemon is tricky, especially if we don't know with the benefit of hindsight that this fantastic piece of kit like Crusader or whatever is going to be a failure. So I went looking through my 1997-1998 edition of my Big Boys Book of Shooty Things, i.e. Jane's Armour and Artillery, to see what was in use or in development at the time. And I spent quite some time trying to come up with some vehicles which are believable, shall we say, to make it sound like it's a good idea to get them to the uninitiated, whilst simultaneously having absolutely no potential, and there really don't seem to be any bad options. At least once one rules out inherently low quality items like North Korean exports, which they would be a hard sell to buy in the first place. The best you can do is to try to limit capability, such as getting the awesome looking BMP-3 with its emphasis on guns over personnel carrier as your personnel carrier. It's a troop carrier that doesn't carry troops. And yes, I know it can carry 7 like a Bradley, although the 2 up front can't exactly dismount. And also you can't use hindsight, which may have been determinable in advance. For example, Challenger 2 came a cropper because the ammunition plant shut down, but there's no way of knowing this in 2000 really. Actually, the Elbonian saboteur could probably do worse than to just buy whatever the British were using at the time. Nothing inherently bad about it, it's just nothing with a future. He also wants to know how much of each type of ammo a World War II tank would carry, and I probably need to make this an FAQ. Generally speaking, you're looking between 30 to 50% armor piercing, the rest is predominantly high explosive. 50-50, excluding the specialty rounds like smoke, would not be incredibly unusual. Unless you're in an early British tank with a 2-pounder, in which case you're firing nothing but AP because nobody's giving you the HE rounds. Colonel Cheng brings us back again to the amphibians and the difference between a purpose-designed amphibious vehicle like an LVT and a regular tank-turned amphibian like a Sherman DD or one with a T6 swimming device. He is correct that a purpose-designed amphibious vehicle will survive rough seas better, and so likely would have suffered less in Normandy, for example. Well, part of the issue was that the DD tanks were being made in the UK, so that's where they were. However, the T6 device tanks were used in Okinawa, and they were supposed to be used in numbers for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. They had the advantage that the gun could be fired whilst underway, unlike the DD screen system. I suspect that the reason that such modified tanks were much less used in the Pacific was simply due to the amount of time it took for them to get there. The Amtracs effectively predated the swimming tanks. For general combat, I don't think there's any great dispute that the modified tanks were better than the boat-hold ones, and they would have been preferred on both fronts had it been an option. Right, gotten to the end, finally. Thus ends Q&A 21. By the time this comes out, I should, inshallah, have my tickets booked to Fort Benning, so keep an eye on my Patreon page for an announcement on that if you're a patron. Aquino weekend is coming up, September. I hope to be up there for that. New Orleans, second weekend of September. Keep an eye on the Facebook page. I'll be at the World War II Museum. I think that's about the majority of it. Oh, I could be swinging by Du Bois, the town about an hour east of Jackson, Wyoming, in about 3 weeks, 2 weeks. Again, keep an eye on the Facebook page for that one if you happen to be in Jackson. I suspect not, because it's not a massive population density, but you never know, you could be there on your Yellowstone holiday. Right, I think that about does it. Don't forget, t-shirts are on sale now for the next 3 or so weeks, and you can always buy the book on Amazon. That's Can Openers. Plug. All right, take care, lads.